Hello, welcome. I'm Susie. This is my podcast. Today, I am continuing my thinking about women. I love them. I am one, so it's hard not to love them, really. But in the previous episode, I talked a little bit about the history of women and the idea of gender throughout history, different roles. What does it mean? How has it changed? How have the different cultures and religious traditions looked at women? I talked a little bit about feminism, and in particular, feminism as set forth by Simone de Beauvoir. I want to kind of take that further a little bit into sort of closer to the modern era. I want to get into the Middle Ages, where I think there's some really interesting shifting in the ideas of women and their places in society. Yeah, let's get into it. Round about the middle of the 1500s, Elizabeth I ascended to the English throne. The reason I want to talk about Elizabeth is because she represents a pivotal moment in history where contemporary understanding of a woman's role in society was challenged in a way that it really hadn't been previously. Now, a note about the English succession. Elizabeth's rise to the throne was messy, complicated, as was much of the English monarchy. Elizabeth was the second daughter of Henry VIII, who was famous for having six wives and having murdered at least four of them, I think, by beheading, or at least two of them by beheading that I can recall. But he had a lot of trouble producing a male heir, which was why succession was messy because succession could really rightfully only be endowed upon the male heir. But the bloodline was what was important, more so than the gender. And so the gender, though, critical, don't get us wrong, the gender could be subverted a little bit. It could be sublimated. The idea of the importance of gender could be made inferior to the idea of the importance of the blood as having distinguished an individual has been chosen by God to rule the church, to rule the people, to rule the state. So gender becomes a secondary classification under those circumstances. But Elizabeth's ascension and its messiness is both interesting and a little bit important in terms of the way that these gender roles sort of map out, right? Like, so Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon, who was Catholic. They had a daughter. Her name was Mary, also a Catholic. Henry himself initially was a Catholic, converted to his own brand new fresh religion called the Church of England. He basically invented it. And his second wife, Anne Boleyn, was a faithful observer of the Church of England because she loved Henry. And they had a daughter, Elizabeth. Anne couldn't produce a male heir, and so she had to go. And then came Jane Seymour, who gifted the king with a son, Edward. But then she died, which was sad. And then there were more wives, but we're done with their part of the story and with Henry's part of the story because Henry later dies and Edward ascends to the throne. So there's really no complication between the three siblings in terms of the primacy of who gets it. It's obviously it goes to the man, and Edward's the man, but he's young and he's kind of sickly. Edward is Protestant. He's C of E, so no complications there until he dies. Uh-oh. What now? So you've got Mary, the daughter of the first queen who the king divorced, and claimed that their marriage was never actually, um, legitimate to begin with. He had all sorts of bendy logic for that. It was mainly because she couldn't give him a male heir, and he tried to get rid of her, and he couldn't because of the church. And then he was like, "Well, fuck the church. Oh, I'm the church." And he created his own church so that he could get rid of Catherine and marry Anne, who would hopefully give him a son, which she did not. Gave him a daughter. So yeah, that became complicated for him. And when Edward died, there was a bit of a struggle. However, Mary, because of the forces of Catholicism in England, and from Rome and the then Holy Roman Empire, which, P.S., they were all related, you guys. Like, all these people were cousins. So, it was family mess as much as it was state affairs and political messiness. But it was situation in which Mary was brought to the throne by Catholic forces and in part legitimized by her betrothal and subsequent marriage to Prince Philip of Spain, Philip II, when he later ascended to the throne. Ugh, he was the worst. So Philip marries Mary, who then ascends to the throne. Mary, known as Bloody Mary, kills a whole lot of Protestants in her effort to squash the growing Protestant Reformation and reclaim the state on behalf of Catholicism. However, things don't go great for Mary. And she has a hysterical pregnancy. She's pretty old by this time. She's like 37. So her pregnancy, or it's also known as a phantom pregnancy, and it turns out it may have been a tumor. It's really sad. She goes through this period of elation where she's like, thank God I did it. God finally gave me a child. It's going to be a son. May he reign forever. And it turns out it's not that. It's something entirely else and something really not good. And Philip, obviously disgusted, he pieces right out. Mary later dies because she was very, very ill. They think with ovarian cancer. So, hello, Elizabeth. Elizabeth ascends to the throne. Now, you can imagine Elizabeth's feelings about marriage and relationships at this point. I mean, look at who her father was. Like, my parents divorced when I was really young. I was like 2 when my folks divorced. And throughout my life, I was like, I don't know about marriage. That seems like a mess. Well, I think in her situation, mother having been beheaded, a series of wives, just blech. Like, you can imagine that the idea of marriage to her, particularly as a woman in that dynamic, was not appealing. And when she got her feet under her as ruler, she put it down. She put that foot down and she said, "Don't talk to me about marriage. Don't talk to me about succession. I don't want to hear it." She was not interested in sharing her crown. And P.S. Let's just remind ourselves that the Elizabethan age was also known as a golden age. She brought about, say what you will, later on the impacts, right? But she basically birthed British imperialism into the world. She defeated the Spanish Armada. Are you kidding me? Like, the little island of Britain, that they were nobody at that time, and they then became the supreme naval force in all of the world. That was under Elizabeth that happened. Now, the ways in which she accomplished these things, in many respects, was by emulating the masculine traits of the office. Now, unlike a Hatshepsut, Elizabeth did not adorn herself with the trappings of men. She very much reveled in the idea of her femininity, so much so that she elevated herself to an almost goddess like status in all the images of her, right? It's this, the elaborate dresses, the wigs, the huge, like, I was about to say Victorian, but this is pre-Victorian, Elizabethan, like men wore the Elizabethan collars, those big ruffle type of things. But, if you recall paintings of Elizabeth, she has these like huge, almost like halo-ish, things behind her, like on her collar, like these really accentuated collars, right? It speaks to like her bigness, her grandeur, all adorned in, pearls and gems and gold, and her power, like Hatshepsut. She's putting forth her power, and her power as a woman ordained by God, when challenged on again and again and again and again, in particular by Cecil, William Cecil, who was kind of the head of her spy network and, just a diplomat, statesman, very, very influential with Elizabeth. And he insisted that she marry because her position on the throne, through the eyes of all the men in the court, was uncertain until she married and produced a male heir. Her ascension to the throne was an accident of nature, but she was endowed by God a special status by virtue of her birth and in the accident of, the successive deaths of those who were supposed to sit on the throne. She was chosen by divinity, but she was not, as many of her female predecessors were, subject to the established gender roles that were set before her. She did not accept them, and they couldn't do anything about it because she was the queen. I mean, what are you going to do? Elizabeth was known as the Virgin Queen. She once said she was married to Britain. She couldn't consider marriage because she was married to Britain. She couldn't think about children because every individual under her sovereignty was her child. It was too big a responsibility for her to share, with an heir. But it did leave the problem of succession open. And it was a significant problem, particularly given the volatility and the instability of the crown, leading up to her role. I mean, it didn't start with Edward. It didn't start with Henry. Henry VIII. It started long before that in the War of the Roses. I mean, hundreds of years of civil war in England, and Elizabeth brought about a peace that that country hadn't seen in a long, 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 long time. It's important that Elizabeth was Protestant, actually, in this context, because Mary obviously fought very hard to bring, Catholicism back into sort of primacy in the state. And her methods to do that were violent and were oppressive. And that was a very male driven policy sort of set forth by Rome. That was how they did, and Spain was way into it. I mean, the Spanish Inquisition, right? Later was a big, driver of that kind of rehabilitation of the people, if you will. One of the reasons why it's important, and as it relates to the succession as well, is that Mary Stuart, who was a cousin of Elizabeth. Once Mary Tudor had died, Bloody Mary, and Elizabeth basically said, "I'm not going to marry." The idea of succession kind of went whoops a daisy in the air, and everybody's like, "What are we going to do? Like, what happens when she dies?" And Mary Stuart, who was a cousin, she was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Margaret, if memory serves, and the Queen of Scotland. And Mary Stuart was Catholic. And so the idea of succession from Elizabeth to Mary, Mary Stuart, was, kind of a non-starter for Elizabeth. That was another reason why she wouldn't name a successor, because the question of her death was a long way off as far as she was concerned, in spite of the fact that people kept trying to kill her. Oh, and most of those people were Catholics. But she she settled upon the idea that the succession could be deferred because Mary had a son, James VI. And James, Elizabeth felt, he was still an infant and could be molded properly. And at a certain point, Mary Stuart is implicated in a Catholic plot to assassinate Queen Elizabeth, and Queen Elizabeth begrudgingly orders her death. And Mary Stuart is beheaded, and after having been confined to the Tower for a long time. But once they have direct evidence that she's involved in this plot, the Queen has basically no choice. So eventually she settles. And there's some dispute about this. P.S. By the way, there's some thinking that William Cecil actually sort of drove it in this direction again to sort of preserve the crown from the instability of an argument about a Catholic successor. Never, because Elizabeth really did resist, like her whole life long. She was like, "Fuck you! Don't talk to me about succession," and deferred it to the point where it was virtually too late. She was on her deathbed. She couldn't, speak. She couldn't move. And William Cecil, leans in and says, "It's James," So, again, there's some dispute about, what that is. But, it is indisputable that the Queen felt strongly that the crown should pass to a Protestant. And at that time, James was indeed a Protestant, having been, spirited away and kept in a very confined upbringing and raised as a Protestant. And again, sort of circling back to the idea of Protestantism, relative to Elizabeth, and why it's important, and why it becomes later important with James, is that the distinction between Catholicism and Protestantism at its basic core is the idea that one can have a personal relationship with God. Catholicism does not accept that. Catholicism assumes that God has a chosen vessel for communication to the flock, and that chosen vessel is the church and those anointed within it, and that they maintain a special place in the world superior to those. Well, you know, Martin Luther, John Calvin, they felt like that seemed like bullshit to them and started a reformation. They started a different way of thinking, and the printing press aided them along. And the Bible became something that people could read in their own language. Didn't matter if you didn't speak Latin anymore. Ha ha. You could read it. You could understand the word of God and develop a personal relationship with him. And that was the fundamental difference between, Christianity and Protestantism. And through our modern eyes, it seems like a whole lot of mess about nothing. But back then, at that time, it was unthinkable. It was unthinkable. And the Catholic Church was very, very threatened by this. It led to all sorts of problems, and that we still struggle with to this very day, actually. Those difficulties and ideas of faith, and what they fundamentally mean. Although I don't think the Catholic Church necessarily stands by the idea that you can't read the Bible anymore, but they sure did at that point. It's interesting because if you think about the idea of translating a relationship with God, the soul, directly to divinity, it does take away some of the hierarchical structures that you are molded to fit within. If you're beginning to think that it's okay for women to read now because women can read the Bible and have a relationship with God, why shouldn't they? They're free souls like everybody else. Even though the rules can still be submissive, they still have the power to have a relationship with God. Well, there's a platform, right? Like there's a springboard to a whole nother notion of thinking about how a woman exists in the world, a soul, an individual soul who can have an individual relationship with God. Well, there's a can of worms. That just opens up a whole bunch of questions. What else can women do? Can they do math? I mean, again, it just that questioning of our assumptions, Protestantism in many ways like cracked open, that melon, and all the stuff kind of, came out, and the whole world went, oh shit, that's messy and complicated. And then there's reactions. James. James had reactions. The Bible, if you are a fan, James the First, having ascended to the crown after Elizabeth died, James, the King James Bible, he did his thing in there. He got in there. He made it. He broke it all into the books in the order that we know it and understand it and contextualize it. And James was a biblical scholar. James was he fancied himself an intellectual. He was. I mean, I'd say to a certain degree, albeit his lens was limited in ways that really didn't allow him the erudition that he sought. He couldn't, he had a distorted view of the world. He had a distorted view of women, and again, look at his family history. Good Lord, it's not really hard to understand why, you know. But James the First ascending to the crown, bringing his really austere notions of puritanical Protestantism. James is the reason we started burning witches. Well, I say we. I never burned a witch, but the American settlers did, and they did that a lot because of the ideas they carried across the Atlantic with them, originated by James. He wrote a whole book about it called Demonology. And in Demonology, James very academically and in a scholarly way breaks down all the different ways that you can identify witches and how you can get them to confess and all the different ways that witches are made and all about their familiars. I mean, it's a whole encyclopedia about it. And in James's mind, he was, he was helping the world to ferret out evil and carry forth the loving word of God. And that was his approach. But that, it obviously opened a doorway to a whole bunch of bad actors. James himself responsible for the burning of some witches for sure, but nothing like what was to come later on, and nothing like what happened in the American settlement in Salem. It was mostly women. I mean, almost exclusively women. There were men for sure, like in England and and in the American settlements, there were men, but those men were lots of times considered associates or familiars, and not necessarily the actors themselves. Consorting with the devil, certainly guilty, guilty, guilty. But the witches were women. The American settlers bring those patriarchal values with them, and that begins to birth our American culture. Now we know this, right? We know that the Puritans were sort of the seeds that germinated the American colonies. We know this. That's not new. But this is a new way of thinking about it to me, that the ideas of bringing alongside us the idea of the chattel sensibility of how women are meant to function in society. And James was certainly amongst his contemporaries in his understanding that women were subservient. I mean, not Elizabeth, perhaps. She was chosen by God, not his mother, but most women. And those themes become common in the modern age, and you see resistance to them in the modern age. And what it boils down to is, the idea of women as property by virtue of their subservience. So the oppression of the patriarchy is really just a natural consequence of, women who are confused about their roles, because, their nature is such that they require that kind of, remediation. They're weak thinkers, and therefore, need to be told. The fundamental idea of women as property is manifested in the problem of marriage. And this is one of those areas where I'm in an unpopular opinion group, but I think, by and large, marriage is a problematic institution. It's a prison for women throughout history. Now, please note, this is not intended to suggest that a pair of people can't have an equitable partnership that they, you know, themselves choose to codify in a legal framework of marriage, right? That's where we are today. I'm in one of those myself. I have a very equitable marriage partnership, but my marriage partnership also functions within the confines of the expectations of marriage. There are freedoms that I choose to give up because of that. And I'm happy to do so, happy to relinquish them, because I'm happy in my partnership. It's equitable and it's fair, and I can live my authentic life, and I've gotten so much out of it, and I give and I get, and it's enriching. It's food for my soul, and it's, the best thing I could have asked for. So I don't want to suggest, or lead anyone to believe that, like, I'm against, romantic partnerships. Small forum, big fan, but I don't love rules and I don't love labels. Marriage, is a historical institution, and it's a religious institution at that. I mean, primarily, let's be honest, I myself was married by, well, he was a Unitarian. So it's like the closest thing, you could get to not a religious person. Like, we almost had like a justice of the peace type situation, but I couldn't find one. So it had to be a minister. That's neither here nor there. This really isn't about me. Or is it? It's my podcast. See, it really is kind of about me. But not in this particular situation. And the idea is that, again, marriage, it's a good thing. I don't want to, I don't want to decry marriage in its purest form, but in its historical form, it sucks. And it sucks for women most of all. It was the only way that a woman could live. That sucks. You're in a situation where you are completely dependent upon another person like a child. This is one of the problems with women and minorities in general, the infantilization of these groups as though, we're not capable of taking care of ourselves. We must have men in our world, to carry and support us. And again, while that sort of overt thinking is pretty well weeded out of most culture, it still exists, but it's mostly been sort of subverted by the idea of independent human beings with their own agency. But the concepts, those subliminal ideas, still exist, right? They're still kind of woven in there, and no problem can be addressed fully until it's brought out into the light and kind of examined fully. Again, phenomenology, you got to question your assumptions. So, within the context of like the idea of women of property and the problem of marriage, there are a whole lot of different ideas that spring from that. None of this is not like comprehensive, but the idea of women's suffrage, right? The right of women to vote, because they were entirely dependent upon their husbands or their fathers. And if they didn't have a father or they didn't have a husband, then they were entirely dependent upon the state or just, predators. There was no economic independence. In the United States, women weren't allowed to own property up until like the early part of the 20th century. Women weren't allowed to own a home or have a bank account without their husband's signature or their father's signature until like I think like the 1970s. Education opportunities were limited, professional opportunities were limited. The Equal Rights Amendment, a constitutional amendment intended to define the equality of women as equal human beings, has never been ratified. It's never been added to the Constitution, though originally introduced like in 1920, reintroduced in the 70s. At that point, it did gain some traction. It was ratified by a bunch of states, but not enough to qualify it. And then the statute of limitations sort of expired on it. And then, even though after that, more states voted to ratify it, it's still never yet been amended to the Constitution. You know, these themes represent an effort to distill an identity down to a physiological feature of reproductive capability, which is a fucking problem, right? Because that then manifests into all sorts of different power dynamics. And a lot of it is birthed from, the moral codifications that are birthed from religious institutions and religious ideologies as well. And as we've learned, religion tends not to see women in a favorable light in that respect. So I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have about, how women fit into that mix and why their resistances have been human resistances, not resistances of, feminism per se, but represent an idea that gender is something that we force upon ourselves in a way that structures our society and our policy and our law. And it structures our wellness. It structures the health of our families. It informs all of these different things in our lives. And we continue to limit ourselves by walking around in these tiny little boxes that make all kinds of assumptions about what women do and what men do, and how we're meant to intersect in society. And I'd like to push back about those notions somewhat. So that'll be next time. I think this is a 3-part series. Okay, so that about does it for this part. In the next piece, I'm going to talk about sex. That's right. Strap in. It's going to be awesome. Sex and morals, and again, how does that reflect on women's roles in society? And we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of gender as a social construct, which it feels like liberal, coding of some kind when I say those things, but which is upsetting because liberal society does appropriate really good academic terms from time to time, and then it's like belabored, with all of this understanding that sort of shifts the focus away from the thing itself. So it's really frustrating because it's such a succinct way to say it. social construct. It's a really, I mean, you know what I mean before I even talk about it. So, we'll talk about it. So thanks a lot for joining me. I really appreciate you being here. If you like it, I hope you'll share it. If you know somebody who you think is into this sort of stuff, why don't you send them a link? Give them a heads up. Let them know I'm out here. I'd love to hear from them. And I'd love to hear from you. I have an email, which is Susie Makes a Podcast. That's SUZI Makes a Podcast at gmail.com. And you can see me on Instagram at Susie Makes a Podcast. And you can keep up with me, keep up with what we're doing. Me. It's just me. You can keep up with me through Instagram. Until next time.